Greet each one this morning in Jesus' name. It is a blessing to be back at church again. Feels like it's been a little while. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for your prayers and your support. Had a lot of people letting us know they were praying for us and showing interest, and had a number of people that apologized that they didn't come to visit, and I want to let you know right now that you don't need to feel bad for that. Our situation made visiting a little difficult. Once we got to the NICU, they only allowed 2 adults in the room ever, so that kind of makes it a little challenging, including parents. So, there's 2 of us, and but it was just a reminder to me. I feel like everything really went pretty well, other than we had to stay at the hospital longer than we were expecting, which I guess you probably should just expect that right out of the gate, right? You don't always get to go home. I know last Sunday morning we were a little upset. We had fully intended we're going to come home, and the doctor came in and, well, you're not going to go home. It might be 4 or 5 more days. But he was very kind about it. He felt really bad. He gave me a hug and he said, I know you're upset. I know you were planning to go home. And we were trying not to act upset, of course, but we were a little sad. And, later on it became clear that it was good. It was good that we just stayed a couple more days. And Gwen feels really well. She's doing great. And the baby's doing good too. So I'm ready to show the baby off, and I think she feels like maybe we better keep her at home a little bit longer yet. She was reminding me this morning that, her due date really isn't for a couple weeks yet. I said, well, yeah, it's true. It looks like she's doing pretty good to me. So, but we are enjoying having her at home. And for those of you who, I know all of you were praying, and some of you helped out in various ways, thank you very much. We appreciate it. It truly is a privilege to be a part of God's family. And this morning, for a message, I'm back in the book of 1 Corinthians again. I didn't know exactly. I had intended to do the whole chapter, but I soon saw that I don't think that's going to work. And looking at the time now, I think it's good. Good we didn't plan to. The chapter is, there are several things in this chapter that I've kind of, as I read over them, and I found this in Proverbs too, some passages you read and they're very clear, well, this is what's being said. Other times you read it and you kind of wonder, well, what exactly is the Lord communicating to me? It's not quite as clear. And we find, I've had a passage, and maybe some of you read this and think, what's that I'm talking about? Well, I would be glad to hear some of your thoughts on it. And we're not going to get into the entire chapter today, but in this chapter, Paul begins by rebuking the Corinthians for their lack of maturity. He has a pretty strong rebuke, and he says, you're still babies, you're still needing milk, and it's time that we move on from that. So we want to talk a little bit about Christian maturity today. He also gives God the glory for any work that's done in the church. And we may mention, he goes back to this argument about him and Apollos, and he kind of, I think, is trying to bring out how foolish that is to be arguing like that. And then, if I understand correctly, verse 11 would have been Menno Simon's favorite verse. Other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And I was blessed that we had 2 songs about foundations this morning. We've been kind of talking about that subject a little bit. I don't know that we're going to get a lot into that verse today. But then later on is the passage that I've had some questions about, where he says, we need to take heed how we build on this foundation. If you build with wood, hay, and stubble, your work will be burned. And if you build with precious stones and gold and proper building materials, your work will be blessed. And so just a few questions before we dive in here. We're going to read verses 1 through 11 to start with. But several questions to think about. Some of these we'll probably look at in the next message, but I'd like you to be pondering, and I would actually be really glad to hear some of your thoughts. The first one is, when should a Christian be ready for strong meat? So we have this thing of maturing. Are there some mile markers that we should, is there any way that we can know that we're maturing at an appropriate rate? Or is that not something we should think about? Everybody's different, and some takes many, many years, and others, they're mature pretty quickly. And is there any wisdom in considering, am I as mature as I should be? When should a Christian be ready for strong meat? And then looking later on in the chapter, what does it mean to build with wood, hay, and stubble? I asked my father-in-law this question. They were there. Actually, Mom has gone home now. They were pretty busy. My youngest sister-in-law, it'd be Gwen's youngest sister, is having her first date tonight, so they had to roar home quickly to be with her. Anyway, we were glad to have my mother-in-law here with us last week. But I asked Dad, I said, what does this mean to build with wood, hay, and stubble? And how is someone saved if their work is destroyed? We kind of think of if you are pursuing the wrong thing or you don't build with what God wants you to build, or how does that work? That what you've done is destroyed, but you are saved. And I'm not sure that I have all the I know I don't have all the answers on that question. So I would ponder those things, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. I think we would be very clear that he's not saying someone can live a sinful life, and at the end there's going to be this refining a purgatory. That's what the Catholics would take this verse and would this is where I think they would get some of their purgatory idea, where okay, you live the best you can, you're not really you're in sin, right? But then when you die, you go into this purgatory fire, and you're there, and stuff's burned off, and then now you're ready for heaven. We do not believe that is true. But he is saying something here. I think it's good for us to ponder what he means. Dad said, in brief, he would see this wood, hay, and stubble maybe as things that are good but not of spiritual value. And so I think it's good for us to ponder the question, what work am I doing that is of eternal value? All right. Those brick I'm laying, they're helpful in this life, but eventually they're going to burn up. And when I stand before God, he's going to expect that I did more than just laid brick, I think. Or I know. All right, let's begin here by reading 1 Corinthians 3, verses 1 through 11. And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ. I have fed you with milk and not with meat, for hitherto you were not able to bear it, neither yet now are ye able. For ye are yet carnal, for whereas there is among you envying and strife and division, are you not carnal and walk as men? For while one saith, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are ye not carnal? Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers by whom ye believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building. According to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know how long these Corinthians had been Christians. Does anyone have any idea, based on what we know of history? Would anybody have any ideas of how long they had been Christians when Paul wrote and said, I'm disappointed that you're not ready for meat. You're still needing milk. I don't really know. Well, I did a little thinking back. If you recall, Paul came to Corinth as he was traveling through Greece, and from there he went to Ephesus. Paul was in Corinth for 18 months, which is about a year and a half, right? And he was in Ephesus for, I think, a total of 2 years when he first stopped at Ephesus. Now, I may need to check my numbers again, but if I'm not mistaken, let's just say that Paul was in Corinth for a year and a half. He went across to Ephesus, and he was there 2 years. While he was in Ephesus, he wrote this message back to the Corinthians. That would mean that the Corinthians had not been Christians for longer than three 3.5 years when he wrote this to them. I bring that out to make a point that I think sometimes we set the bar just a little bit low when it comes to Christian maturity. So these Christians, they had gone from not knowing the gospel message, right? When Paul came to them, I believe he was the first one to preach to the Corinthians. He would bring that out here. He said, I laid the foundation. I was the first one. 3 years later, or maybe 4, but he wrote Corinthians while he was in Ephesus on the first time. So it couldn't have been, probably not even 4 years. He's writing back to them and he's saying, look, I see these issues that you're having, and I would like to write deeper spiritual truths to you. And in this 3-year time period, I would have expected you to be more mature than you are. And now remember, he's writing to first-generation Christians that did not know anything. Now, I think many of them knew the scriptures. Many of them were Jews. But as far as the gospel message, they had been ignorant. And he said, you should be ready for strong meat, and you're not ready yet. And so he was a little disappointed. Did the Corinthian church view themselves as babes? Well, if you recall back to chapter 2, the Jews were proud of their religion, and the Greeks were proud of their philosophy. And so it appears that the Corinthians actually thought they were pretty intelligent. They felt pretty good about how smart they were. And so when Paul writes to them and says, you're a babe that still needs a bottle, I wonder how that went down. I'm afraid they probably didn't really care for that message. Maybe they were disappointed in themselves, or maybe they were offended. I don't know. This word carnal, I looked it up, and this word carnal is the same word that is used over in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14, where it says, but the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God. And it means under the influence of our fleshly appetites. So it just means these Corinthians, instead of putting on the new man, they were still approaching life, and they were driven by their fleshly appetites. They were being immature. Paul doesn't say that you're not Christians anymore, but he does say that you're still carnal. And he gave 3 proofs of immaturity. He didn't just accuse them, now look, you need to straighten up, but he said, look, these are the reasons that I'm saying this. He gave 3 reasons. He said, among you, there's envying, strife, and divisions. And if these are among you, then you are, let's just face it, that you're carnal. And so I thought it might be good to take a brief look at these 3. So the definition for these 3 words, the first one is envy. And it is defined, Webster says, it's a feeling of discontent and ill will because of another's advantages or possessions. It's a resentful dislike of someone who has something that you desire. All right? So, well, let's look at the other 3, and then I'm going to come back to it. Strife has the idea of bitter struggle or conflict. It's marked by argument and competition. Now, we realize, and Jonathan brought that out this morning in the Sunday school class, that there will be conflict at times if we stand on truth. But I believe in the Bible, the word strife is used in a negative sense. When we see strife, we're not talking, now we do see the word striving at times. We're striving for the faith of the gospel. When we see the word strife, it would mean, usually it means, and I didn't take the time to look up every verse that had the word strife in it, but the way it's used here is not a striving for the faith of the gospel, but rather a strife that comes because we're competing against each other, we're arguing with each other, we are essentially fighting in a way that is not acceptable to God. It's not promoting truth, okay? And that was the sort of strife that was going on here. They were arguing about whether they were going to follow Paul or Apollos. And we're not going to go back into that too much. I preached the message already on the different factions that were going on. Divisions here, it would refer to separation. And the sad thing about division, and we do realize there are times that we need to separate ourselves from something for a good reason, but the division here is also not a positive word. And it means that these people were unwilling to reconcile, to forgive, or to submit to one another. And so we have a disagreement, and what's our response? Well, we'll just all go into our separate camps, and then anybody else in the other camp is, I'm of Paul, so anybody that likes Apollos, well, they're out in the cold. And as I looked over these three, envy, strife, and divisions, I had to admit that, especially the first two, those are common temptations, aren't they? This thing to, maybe you get this feeling of, well, why can't I have what someone else has? And we know it's not the way we should feel, but I think the devil tempts us with it at times. This tendency to, when we're disagreeing about something, rather than working toward reconciliation, just arguing and fighting about it and being upset. And so Paul looks at what's happening here, and he says, look, you can say what you want to say, but you are still carnal if you are experiencing these things. And these are the natural response from our old man. And so I don't want to discourage anyone this morning, but I do think we need to be honest about the fact that if we have things like this in our life, we are yet carnal. We're still immature. We need to continue working. And I appreciated what Brother Eddie said this morning, that, maturity is not an event, it is an ongoing process. But I'd like to look a little bit at this idea of spiritual maturity, because I think Paul was really concerned here. This was important to him. And I think Paul is trying to draw a parallel here between physical maturity and spiritual maturity. Maturity refers to growth or development. And right now we're experiencing that. I call it a fun time, where you bring a baby home from the hospital and you just see the change. Things happen pretty rapidly, and yet it's just a lot of fun to have a little baby in the house again. And she's really little. She's only 4 pounds, so she's the smallest one we've had yet. But I was reminded, when we were in the hospital, there were certain mile markers that they needed to see before they were going to let her go home. One of them was a little frustrating to me, was the idea that she needs to start gaining weight. And I thought, well, babies don't start gaining weight for a while after they're born. They'll often lose weight. Are we going to be here for 3 weeks waiting for her to gain an ounce or two? And thankfully they didn't say that. They just said she can't lose more than 10% of her body weight. And they'd like to see it start to stabilize. And there were just a number of things. If she doesn't do these things, she's not going home because she's still in the danger zone. And as she grows, there are going to be mile markers. We're going to be watching her. And if she doesn't meet those, we start getting concerned, And babies, they don't all grow at exactly the same rate. But if your child is, let's say she's 2 years old and she's not walking yet, well, we're starting to get a little concerned. Some babies talk a lot sooner than others, but we like to see them reaching these mile markers and maturing physically. And milk is great when they're a baby. But there's going to be a time where we're expecting them to be sitting at the table and eating, and sometimes mom and dad might argue a little bit about, how soon they should start and how soon they shouldn't. I don't know. But I'd just like to ask you this question. Are there some spiritual mile markers? And I know we could look at other people and say, well, now that person's spiritually mature or immature. And I'm not saying, if you are responsible for a person, your children or those under your care, I think there's some value in that. But I would like this to be more of a personal thing this morning, to think about, I am now nearing 40 years old. Some days I'm a little disappointed that I'm not more mature than I am. I thought by the time I got to 40, I would pretty much have, maturity would have pretty much arrived, you'd have thought. And there are some days I'm like, wow, I know better than that. When am I going to mature here? I mean, it's already been almost 40 years. I don't know if you've ever felt that way or not. Probably we all have had an experience like that or two, but Are there some spiritual mile markers that can help us determine whether we're developing as we should spiritually? And what is wrong if a person is spiritually immature? What should we do about it? Well, I have several. These are very general. These are, it's not anything revolutionary, but I'd like for us to consider them in thinking about spiritual maturity. First of all, I think we all need to be convinced of this, that it is God's will that a person experiences ongoing spiritual growth. And let's just think of that parallel between physical growth and spiritual. It is God's will, after a person is born physically, that they grow. And if a child doesn't grow, we start to get concerned. We're worried. And just as a person needs to grow physically, God expects us to grow spiritually. You know, our rate of physical growth is somewhat determined by our nutrition and several other external factors. But most people develop physically at a similar rate. Likewise, I believe that God would have us show clear spiritual growth, and it is not wrong for us. And this is where I wasn't quite sure how to say it. I want to be careful here. I don't want to say something that's wrong. But I don't think it's wrong for us to have expectations both for ourselves and for others around us, especially those in our care, that we would have some expectation that this person is maturing. We hope to see strong spiritual growth, and we recognize that not everybody is going to mature as rapidly, but we don't want to see anyone declining spiritually, for sure. And I think we should be concerned if it appears that someone is, the spiritual level that we would have expected is not there. You know, Paul here is writing this to these Corinthians 3 years. That's not very long to go from not knowing anything about the Lord to, well, now I'm expecting you to be ready to eat some meat. You know, we do not expect our youth to have the same level of spiritual maturity as our grandpas and grandmas. I don't think so. We expect a lot out of our grandpas and grandmas. Now, I don't want to be too hard on you, but we do. We look to you as, you know, you've had years serving the Lord, and we do look to you as examples, and I want to bless you in that. And we don't expect our youth to have the same level of maturity, but we do expect to see them growing. We love to see that. I think we should all love to see that. That should be what we want to see. And I think we should be just as concerned about a lack of spiritual development as we are about a lack of physical development, or more so. Secondly, I think we need to remember that physical development happens naturally. Spiritual maturity doesn't just happen. It's not automatic. It comes as we commit our lives to Christ. What that does mean is that it is possible for a person to keep right on developing physically, but spiritually they're declining. And just because someone is 40 years old, they might be 40 in years, but does that mean that they're 40 in spiritual maturity? It's not automatic. And that brings me to something I think we need to consider. Time alone is not the cure for spiritual immaturity. We physically mature according to our biological clock. We can't speed it up and we can't slow it down. And time does play a role in spiritual maturity. We cannot learn everything at once. We all start as spiritual babes, right? We start as spiritual babes, every one of us. And we're not expected to know everything all at once. But what I want you to take home from this portion, and there are others in the New Testament, I'm going to read one here in just a minute. The tendency is, I believe, the temptation is for people to mature spiritually more slowly than they ought. Is that a fair statement? I think there's a temptation there for us to mature more slowly than we ought, and we need to be aware of that. Hebrews 5:12-13 says this, "For when the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. For every one that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe." Once again, just bringing out that I think, we don't know if Paul wrote Hebrews or not, but the writer of the Hebrews is writing there, it's time for you to be teachers. and you're still needing milk. So let's remember, I think if we just go into default mode, we will mature spiritually more slowly than God is expecting. He's expecting more from us. Okay? Time alone is not a cure for spiritual immaturity, and that's why I think we need to be especially careful. We hear maybe statements like this: boys will be boys. And some of those, we kind of start making excuses. Just a little more time is needed. Well, that may be the case. But I'd like to warn you that time alone is not the cure for spiritual immaturity. We can be 60, 70 years old and be very spiritually immature if we have not chosen to apply ourselves. There is a choice that we make, I believe. We have a part to play. Now, obviously, it's not all up to us. Certainly not. Matthew Henry says this, and I thought it was a good conclusion. Christians are utterly to blame who do not endeavor to grow in grace and knowledge. If we're not putting forth that effort, we are to blame. Now, this could be daunting, but on the other hand, I'd like to look at this in a positive sense. Have you ever wished that you were older? Some of you older ones are not wishing that anymore, maybe, but maybe you are. I don't know. I think there are younger people that sometimes wish we could speed it up just a little bit. If I could just be 16, right? If I could just be 20. Well, you'll quit doing that soon enough. Maybe you wish you could turn it back. We can't do that. But when it comes to spiritual maturity, we are not limited by time. A 20-year-old can be very spiritually mature. It's our choice, right? If I'm reading this passage correctly, it is God's will that we mature spiritually. And He is able to do more than we could ask or think. And so God is not holding us back. God's not holding us back. Time is not holding us back. No, I don't want to frustrate anyone. I don't want you conscientious 15-year-olds to be frustrated that you're not as mature as grandpa or grandma. That's not what God's asking of you. But let's remember that our spiritual maturity is not simply dependent on time. And we need not be hampered by that. Let's grow in grace. So Paul says, the reason that you're so immature, the problem I'm seeing here is you're arguing, you're fighting over something that is pointless. Who is better, Paul or Apollos? And Paul says here, we're both working for the same thing. You don't need to be arguing about this. You're wasting your time because we're both working for the same thing. But he did mention something, and I'd like to point this out kind of in conclusion here, something that I found interesting. Even though Paul and Apollos were both involved in ministering, there was a difference in the work they were doing. Did you notice it? Paul planted and Apollos watered. Now that's a similar work. Planting and watering are two different tasks, but they have the same goal. Paul was certainly a church planter. He went from one church to the next, and he didn't stay anywhere very long. And he even says here in 1 Corinthians, I don't baptize people. We read that verse in chapter 1. He said, I haven't baptized. He named a few people he baptized, but that's not my work to baptize. He laid the foundation. We need to have visionaries. We need to have men. We need to have evangelists. We need to have people who are out there pioneering. But we also need to have shepherds, people who are willing to lead the flock. And Paul always would ordain leaders, and then he would move on. God has given us different talents, and we all need to work together. Sometimes a visionary, someone who's out starting new works, he can maybe feel a little hampered by a shepherd, someone who's, let's disciple the ones that we have, and let's take some time here. Well, no, we have more people that need to hear the gospel. I'm ready to move on, you see. And so those two can start to conflict unless they remember, as God said, like Paul wrote here, that we're both in the same ministry. Our ministry doesn't need to be in conflict. It's the same. And I believe that the devil would like to pit workers in the Lord's kingdom against each other. He likes to do that. He does it in different ways. Paul says, let's not be carnal in that way. Let's not be immature. my mind was drawn to some visionaries that I feel like I've observed in my lifetime. Some of us have worked for AMA over the years. And a lot of the churches that have started, the missions that AMA is now a part of, started, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Men like Eli Glick, William McGrath was one that started many new works. Sanford Yoder, I don't know how many of you have read Sanford Yoder. There was a book written about him, Trailblazer, I think it was called. Look at what all's happened in Costa Rica because of his trailblazing. And the thought went through my mind, do we still have men doing that today? Are we still starting new works, or are we kind of doing better at the watering? We're watering really well. Are we still planting? Both are important. Next time I preach from this chapter, I'd like to move on into the foundations that are mentioned here and what we build with. But I'd like to leave you with this question, thinking about that. You may consider yourself a planter, someone who likes to blaze a trail. Or you may consider yourself more someone who waters, nurtures. What work are you doing that is of eternal value? And I would really like to hear some feedback of what Paul is writing about when he talks about these different building materials. I would enjoy that. That would help me it would give me a lot of help when I sit down to study this portion. So just be thinking about that. What work are you doing that is of eternal importance, that won't just be finished when this world passes away?